So we're going to have a lecture over Chapter 7, and Chapter 7 covers what we call cellular respiration. Your textbook calls it how cells harvest energy, but it's cellular respiration, which is an application of the concepts we learned from Chapter 6 and Chapter 5 and Chapter 4 too. So what we're doing is putting a lot of things together and learning about the main metabolic process that all cells do, and that's called cellular respiration. I know when you think of the word respiration, you probably think of breathing in and breathing out. That is respiration, or at least that's ventilation, but that is respiration at an organ level, organ system level. So we're thinking about lungs and circulatory system and blood. But once the oxygen gets into your blood and goes to your cells, cellular respiration is what happens next. What happens to the oxygen? And so when we think about cellular respiration, we're going to be talking about energy transfers and transformations. And so even though oxygen is going to be involved, it's not going to be the main topic, and that might surprise you. But it's going to be about energy transfers and transformations. So we're going to look at, these are the study objectives here, but let's go on. All right, so life relies on energy transfers and transformations. And we said that one definition of death is that there's no longer any energy being transferred or transformed in the cell or in the organism. So life is driven by energy, and different kinds of organisms get their energy different ways. Autotrophs build their own organic molecules by a process called photosynthesis. Heterotrophs have to eat other organisms to get their organic molecules. But no matter how an organism gets the organic molecules, then once they have them, they all use cellular respiration to transfer the energy that's in the covalent bonds of the organic molecules into the energy into the energy of ATP molecules. So it's a transfer of energy from one molecule to another. It's going to involve lots and lots of steps, and there's going to be some vocabulary that we want to review. Some of it was in your preview assignment, and some of it is going to be new. So you'll remember that potential energy is stored in covalent bonds. So in organic molecules, that's mainly going to be the carbon to hydrogen covalent bonds. It can also be in the carbon to carbon to a lesser extent. But the carbon to hydrogen covalent bonds have a lot of energy. And you have those in carbohydrates, you have them in proteins and fats. So the reactions that break down these covalent bonds to get that energy, these are going to be called oxidation reactions. These are breakdown reactions, but they're much more substantial breakdown than the reactions we've talked about before. We talked about hydrolysis of polymers down to their monomer components. Now what we're talking about is like actually breaking down the monomers bond by bond, all those covalent bonds, into very little left, just the atoms and very small molecules, carbon dioxide and water specifically. But the oxidation of glucose, the oxidation of the amino acids, the oxidation of fatty acids, breaking those all down, those are all exergonic reactions. And that releases the potential energy from the covalent bonds. But the exergonic release of that energy is coupled to the endergonic reaction, particularly that we learned in Chapter 6, which is called the synthesis of ATP. So ATP is synthesized when ADP, which has two phosphates, gets covalently attached to one more phosphate, which we call inorganic phosphate. So ADP plus PI yields ATP. So that is an endergonic reaction, and the energy to drive the synthesis of ATP comes from the breaking of the bonds of the organic compounds. And that's what cellular respiration is. So what's funny is we haven't even mentioned oxygen, but we can talk about cellular respiration. Some cellular respiration happens without oxygen. Some happens with oxygen. But that's not the fundamental definition of what's happening here. Cellular respiration is a transfer of energy from the bonds of an organic compound into the bonds of ATP. ATP is the currency that the cell wants to have. A few definitions. Oxidation is a general term in chemistry, refers to a loss of electrons. And when covalent bonds are broken, then there can be a loss of electrons. So oxidation is going to involve a loss of electrons. It's going to involve the breaking down of something. And the opposite concept, when something loses electrons, something else gains them. One molecule has a covalent bond that's broken and the electrons are released or lost and they carry that energy. There has to be another molecule or another atom that accepts or takes those electrons. So it's a handoff. And one member of this event gives electrons away, one takes them. And so when those two things are happening, we call it redox, because one molecule is giving away electrons and the other one is taking them. So that handoff is called a redox reaction. Reduction is a gain of electrons. And then we have another term, dehydrogenation. That would be the loss of a hydrogen atom, a whole atom from a molecule. And recall that a hydrogen atom consists of one electron and one proton. So sometimes when we think about dehydrogenation, we're thinking about the whole hydrogen atom. In this case, however, we tend to be focusing on that loss of electron. So dehydrogenation goes with oxidation a lot of times. You'll see those two in there. So redox reactions involve electrons carrying energy, and when they're released from one molecule and then picked up by another molecule, the energy is also being transferred. There are molecules in the cell that act as electron carriers, and by that we mean they pick up electrons and then they hand them off to the next molecule. So very much a middleman in this process. And the most common electron carrier in cellular respiration is called nicotinamide adenosine dinucleotide. Luckily, we use the acronym NAD, and there's a plus sign because there's an extra positive charge on the molecule. It's kind of a medium-sized molecule. I'll show you on the next page, but you don't have to remember it. You just remember the initials NAD+. This molecule acts as an electron carrier for cellular respiration. When NAD+ picks up 2 electrons and also 1 proton, it becomes a different form of itself called NADH. And because the NAD+ is gaining 2 electrons, that's a reduction. The reaction, though, is reversible. NADH can give away its electrons and become NAD+ again. So it can go either way. So in this picture, I give you a sense of how big the molecule is. This is NAD+, right here. You don't have to memorize it. It's kind of a medium-sized molecule. And if you look real hard, when NAD+ picks up 2 electrons and 1 proton, you may not even be able to tell. There's a small change in it, and it looks like this. So this is the form of NAD, which is the reduced form. It's called NADH. If NADH gives away 2 electrons and 1 proton, it goes back to looking like the first guy. I like to think of NAD+ and NADH as 2 versions of a pickup truck. It's the same pickup truck. Here's a pickup truck. And the NAD+ is a pickup truck that doesn't have anything in the bed. It doesn't have a load. When it picks up 2 electrons and 1 proton, it becomes NADH, and NADH has those 2 electrons in the bed. There's the wheels. Okay, so NAD+ is a carrier that doesn't have a load. NADH is a carrier that does have a load. And the load are the 2 electrons. And so all really that NAD+ is doing is it's picking up 2 electrons, and then we call it NADH, but then it's going to drop those off somewhere else. It's literally transporting them, passing them off from one molecule to another in the cell. So we call them electron carriers. And there's lots and lots of NAD plus molecules in the cell. So cellular respiration overall is going to involve dozens and dozens of redox reactions, which are electron transfers. And electrons carry energy, so it's also energy transfers, which means there's going to be a lot of electron carriers and some things called electron acceptors. But in the end, what's going to happen is what we call the high energy electrons that came from the covalent bonds of glucose as glucose is broken apart, or the covalent bonds of fatty acids or amino acids, those carbon to hydrogen bonds. Once those electrons are passed off to different electron carriers, they will little by little lose most of their energy, and ultimately at the very end of the process there's one molecule that acts as what we call the final electron acceptor, and he's the guy who takes those electrons ultimately and keeps them. So the electrons come from the bonds of the organic molecule, glucose or an amino acid or a fatty acid, and they get passed along, and then they end up being held by a final electron acceptor. And in that process, within that process, which I haven't explained yet, there's going to be a transfer of energy to ATP. So the types of respiration can be grouped in part by what the final electron acceptor is for that particular type of cell or for that particular pathway. Some cells do what's called aerobic respiration. In that case, that means that the final electron acceptor for that process is oxygen. So oxygen does come into play for cells that do what we call aerobic respiration, which we do. Humans do. But some organisms do what's called anaerobic respiration. In that case, the final electron acceptor is an inorganic molecule like sulfur, meaning a non-carbon compound, some kind of inorganic molecule or atom like sulfur, but definitely not oxygen. That's reasonably common. On Earth, early Earth had a lot of these kinds of organisms that did this. There still are some today. And then fermentation would be an organism that has a final electron acceptor that is an organic compound, and again, not oxygen. And one that we're going to talk about is called pyruvate. So the main difference in how you classify respiration is one way that we classify respiration types is by what the final electron acceptor is. Probably fermentation or something like fermentation evolved first, anaerobic respiration very early, and aerobic respiration definitely came last, but it ends up now on Earth being very, very common. So it wasn't the first to evolve, but it's very common now. So we'll talk a lot about aerobic respiration, but we will come back and circle back to anaerobic and fermentation towards the end of the lecture. So the oxidation of glucose means breaking down glucose bond by bond, and a molecule of glucose has the formula C6H12O6, and in the presence of oxygen, so this example is going to be aerobic respiration, in the presence of oxygen, glucose can be broken down into 6 carbon dioxide molecules and produce 6 molecules of water in the process. And that's just the breakdown of glucose. We usually use glucose as our example organic compound when we first teach respiration, and then we can modify the process to show you how amino acids and fatty acids can be oxidized. So the delta G is a negative number. That means that should tell you that it's an exergonic reaction. You don't need to memorize the delta G actual value, but it's an exergonic reaction. And this is a pretty large amount of energy, but it's not going to be released all at once. If you burn a log in a fire, that is a kind of oxidation, but it releases all the energy at once. That's why you get a flame. In the case of a cell, we're going to be breaking down an organic compound by oxidation, but there's not going to be a flame because the release of energy comes in very small amounts, which is good because I don't want a flame inside my cell. So aerobic respiration then couples the exergonic release of energy from the oxidation of glucose to the endergonic process, which is the synthesis of ATP. So down here, what I have is really the full equation for aerobic respiration. You have the part of it, which is the part that is the oxidation of glucose. These are the reactants, and these are the products of the oxidation of glucose. And then also you have the reactants and the products for the synthesis of ATP. So that's the coupling. The arrow here, which represents the making and breaking of bonds, is actually, I'm going to give you a number, 25 steps. And the blanks that I have here, the reason I give you blanks is when I was in school, they tried to give us an exact number. Exactly how many ATP would you get from one molecule of glucose? It turns out that trying to put an exact number on it ends up not being very useful or accurate. So we're going to say that there's about 30 ADP, about 30 inorganic phosphates, and those are put together to make about 30 ATP. And what I mean by about 30 is something in the 30s. It's not 3, it's not 300. When I was in school, they gave us exact numbers, 36 or 38. They had these exact numbers. And then at one point, the textbook said 34. And so I think at some point, someone said, look, let's just give us a kind of a ballpark. So something in the 30s. So this equation down here, you do need to know. Write this one down. But this is a summary equation of all 25 steps, meaning they're just showing us the very, very beginning reactants and the very, very end products. We're not getting to see all the intermediate stuff. Not in this equation, but we are going to go step by step through the different parts of cellular respiration. Before we do that, we want to look at the structure of the mitochondrion because the mitochondrion is the site of cellular respiration. I emphasized that earlier in the course. We don't want to hang on to the powerhouse of the cell anymore. I mean, that's okay, but in college we say the site of cellular respiration. Some of the cellular respiration happens actually in the cytoplasm, and all cells have cytoplasm. So some parts of respiration all cells can do. In fact, all parts all cells can do, but the parts that are in the mitochondrion are going to be particular to cells that have mitochondria. So that didn't make any sense at all. Let me say that again. Some cells don't have mitochondria, and so all parts of respiration take place in the cytoplasm. Some cells do have mitochondria, like eukaryotes, and so for them, part takes place in the cytoplasm and part takes place in the mitochondria. I think that makes a little more sense. But anyway, for the mitochondrial events for eukaryotes, we do need to know the parts of the mitochondrion, which I skipped over earlier when we covered parts of the cell in chapter 4, knowing that we would come back to it here. So I'm drawing the outline of a mitochondrion. You see an artist has drawn a very nice drawing here as well. Mitochondrion has two membranes. The outer membrane is smooth. The shape of the organelle is, I would call it shaped like a capsule, like a pill, like a capsule or kind of an elongated oval. And the outer membrane is smooth. The inner membrane, though, is very folded and crinkled up. The outer membrane and the inner membrane, okay, have in between and inside of them, they're full of a liquid material. Like the cytoplasm, like the cytosol is an aqueous solution. The liquid inside the mitochondrion is an aqueous solution. In between the inner and the outer membrane, there's a space, a liquid-filled space called the intermembrane space. And then the very innermost compartment, completely bounded by the inner membrane, is called the matrix. So you have two membranes and two spaces. I'm going to draw my drawing of a mitochondrion. I enjoy drawing even though I'm not very good at it. Let me get a different color. Let's go with blue. Okay, so on my drawing, you can compare it to the artist's drawing here. This right here is the outer membrane. Right here is the inner membrane. That's the wrinkly one. Oops. And then right here is the intermembrane space. And right here is the matrix, which is a space. The folded structure of the inner membrane is referred to as the cristae. I probably won't use that term. I'll just say the folded inner membrane. But you might see cristae at some point and you'll know what that is. All right, so those are the parts of the mitochondrion. So in the next lecture segment, we're going to go through all the phases of cellular respiration, and we're going to have it spatially organized according to where it happens. So chronologically and spatially organized. So I'm going to end this segment now, and you can move on to the next segment if you're ready, or take a break.